On today's episode of Anish Thing, I speak with Priya Mirza about a lot of things from the Constitution that we may really not know about or think about on a daily basis, but these really do affect our daily lives. Priya, welcome to Anish Thing. Good to have you on the podcast. And before we get into the Constitution, I would love to know a little bit about you and your podcast as well.
Hi, Aneesh. Thank you so much for having me here. And yeah, so about my podcast, The Longest Constitution, is very dear to me. It started in August 21, and it's a weekly podcast where I talk about how the Constitution affects our everyday life. And it's been quite a journey, yeah.
Such an important thing, right? How the Constitution uh, reflects and comes into everyday play, but we usually never end up thinking of it at all.
Absolutely. And that's also because when we think about the Constitution from a layperson's point of view, one invokes it on Republic Day or one thinks about it occasionally. And it's a very lengthy document. Part of it is because our Constitution is, as all constitutions are, is also an aspirational document. It's also an administrative document, but it is the aspiration and it's the nation's moral GPS which sets its stone, and I think that's what's its spirit about the our fundamental rights which have been granted to us. And I think that is perhaps the most essential part of it, that we are aware of what has been granted to us and how one can attain that.
Somewhere in today's episode, I also want to touch upon the aspirational aspects. Again, something
Mm-hmm.
I've never thought of, that the Constitution can be aspirational and have those aspects. But yeah, very fascinating. I really want to touch upon that. But if we rewind back, and this can
Mm-hmm.
be like a Constitution guide to dummies in a way, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
if I take a step back, uh, how does how did the Constitution even come into play, and what's the evolution? How does it keep getting changed or evolved? What are the mechanisms for that?
The Constitution is a text, and it is, and there is an element of magic in that, because one posits such an enormous amount of faith in written words. And the evolution of constitutionalism itself is something which is fairly modern. So, starting from the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the idea that a set of people proclaim themselves to be representing all people itself is a figment of imagination, but it does become real. And its invocation, one, they posit some sort of faith and vision in a particular in a particular text, and that is part of constitutionalism. So India is part of the global journey in positing that faith in a text and creating the fantasy that a certain group of people can in fact represent a larger invisible set of people. And it is in the realizing that vision that a constitution's metal is met and measured. Yeah.
Interesting. What do you think we should begin with on today's episode?
um well, I would like to start off with, since we just celebrated Republic Day, I'd like to direct our attention to something which we tend to overlook quite often, and that's the electoral bond scheme. So, although we are fairly proud, and we ought to be proud of the fact that we have had uninterrupted elections and we are a thriving democracy, the purpose of a democracy is not just the conduct of elections, but a lot of it is about the process as well. And there are a couple of laws which regulate that, about candidates, how much money can be spent. So the electoral bond scheme is something which was introduced in 2016 and 17. And what is pivotal about this is two things. The first is that although these bills, um, although these amendments were not really financial bills, they were notified as financial bills by the Speaker. And secondly, these amended four laws. And these laws are the Companies Act 2013, the Income Tax Act 1961, the Representation of People Act 1951, and the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act. And the reason why I'm going into such elaborate length over here is because the tweaks to these laws fundamentally allow companies. So there were caps on how much money companies can contribute to political parties. And what these amendments fundamentally do is that they remove those caps. So previously, companies, there was a limit on how much a company could contribute. It was 7.5% of the last 3 years, the net profit of the previous 3 years. However, that cap has been removed. Another limitation was that 50% of, not more than 50% of the company could be owned by a foreign company. So that has been removed. And as a consequence, the electoral bond scheme allows anonymous corporations and individuals to buy bonds
Okay.
starting from rupees 1,000 when it goes up to a crore in order to fund political parties. So the question is, why is that a problem? The problem is that this fundamentally allows vast amounts of black corporate money. And with the removal of the 50% limit, it also means that a shell company could, in fact, be contributing to political parties. And from the time they've been introduced, the denominations in which they're being bought are mostly a crore. So when Arun Jaitley introduced this in Parliament, it was in the name of transparency that it would in fact eliminate. And this whole emphasis that digitizing channels and flows, financial flows, makes things transparent. One can see over here, it's the complete opposite. So one does not, in fact, know who is funding political parties, and as a consequence, there are vast amounts of black money swishing around when it comes to how much political parties are, in fact, garnering from this. Yeah.
So when you say they buy a bond, again,
Mhm.
sorry to sound like super ignorant on this, they're buying a bond of the party.
So how this functions is that it's a promissory instrument. So one buys a bond from the State Bank of India. So the Election Commission is the body which regulates, conducts elections, and is responsible for this. So when we come to the Representation of People Act later, and when we look at campaign finance laws, there are caps on how much a candidate can in fact spend during election campaign. However, what these bonds do is that a person or a corporation can in fact buy a bond of a specific denomination from the State Bank of India. The only institution which is aware of the identity of this is the State Bank of India, not the
Got it.
Election Commission or individuals. And following that, that money is then encashed by the political party. So
Oh,
the
got it.
State Bank of India is, yeah. Yeah, but it bypasses the Election Commission completely. And when questions have been raised, so there were two petitions filed in the Supreme Court. Because over the years, paradoxically, the Supreme Court has also broadened the right of the voter to know about the candidate's criminal background, educational background, their assets. But oddly enough, this has in fact been upheld by the Supreme Court by its silence. Yeah.
Got it.
Although there have been Supreme Court judgments where the voters' right to know about candidates has in fact expanded, there are dark patches in our democratic processes which we tend to often overlook. So, for example, we have an Anti-Defection Act. Now, what this Anti-Defection Act does is that it disqualifies a legislator if she votes or abstains from voting contrary to party directions.
Okay.
And this sort of control is something across democracies where parties issue a whip for important bills, and members have to abide by that. But what it has meant in India is that because the penalty is disqualification itself, legislators very seldom, in fact, want to use their conscience or exercise their vote according to their free or what they would like. Uh, so, if political parties are wealthy corporations, not only are they wealthy corporations, they're also controlling what's happening within parliament, because legislators of a political party would, in fact, be constrained to follow party directions when it comes to voting. And that is paradoxical for a couple of reasons. Maybe we can come to that in a minute.
But can we just again go back a little bit and even talk about who or what a legislature is and does?
Oh, okay. The task. So, who is a legislator? That's a great question. A legislator legislates, and um, the task of a legislature uh, is to initiate drafts, debate, discuss, produce laws. Interestingly, legislatures are a rather expensive requirement to legislate, to produce a law. And historically, states have done this without a legislature. So, why do we need this entire exercise of conducting elections, voting, and a representative taking an oath and then assembling? They have to function within certain number of hours for a certain number of days. So why are we spending so much money on that? And the whole idea is that the legislative process itself is something which is needs to be fair and transparent, and that is what makes a law legitimate. So of course laws can be uh, produced by a state otherwise, but this process itself is something which is important.
Got it.
And so interestingly, India, how does one become a legislator? The qualifications to be a legislator are in fact very, very low in India. So, for example, the only two grounds are that you have to be a citizen and you have to be of a particular age. So, for the Lok Sabha, you have to be 25 and a citizen of India. And for the Rajya Sabha, it's 30. So, when the constitution was being drafted, these were kept at a rather low bar. And the reason was that the idea was that a public office should in fact be open to the public, and if you have educational qualifications, or if you have bars on, if you need to possess a certain amount of property, you would in fact disenfranchise people, and the idea was to enfranchise people. So interestingly, following in the last 20 years, the sort of legislators we have are increasingly wealthy. So just to pull out a little bit of data which I thought would be quite interesting and illuminate this. So in 2004, 30% of the Lok Sabha members were crorpatis. And in 2014, this jumped up to 82%, which means that, I mean, the conclusion that one can draw is that the richer the candidate, the higher chances of winning an election, sorry, which defeats the purpose of having a low bar to be qualified at all. So there are these interesting set of paradoxes where the composition of the house is getting relatively wealthier, and the wealthier it gets, the harder it becomes. It harder it gets for laypersons or people to actually access that public office.
I think that's also very interesting, right? Like regular people trying to access public office. That's something I
Mhm.
at some point also want to really understand more about. How does a common citizen even uh, think in that direction, right? Whether it's approaching a political party or stuff like that. That's for
Mhm.
another time. We're also talking about how legislators also have more freedom of speech and like a few exceptions that are made for them.
Yeah, absolutely. So, but before I get to that, what is another peculiar space is that while for the parliament and for state legislative assemblies, the qualifications are fairly low. At the third tier of representation, which is the Panchayati Raj local bodies, a couple of states have introduced peculiar qualifications. And I just wanted to go over them because it just highlights the state of local bodies and how twisted a couple of qualifications are. So, for example, Rajasthan introduced this qualification that candidates have to have a class 10, they should have passed class 10. Haryana followed suit. So, in a couple of states, it's educational qualifications. And remember, this is for the lowest level of representation. So, this is grassroots representation, local and urban bodies. But there are other bizarre uh, grounds to debar or disqualify candidates. So, for example, the state of Andhra Pradesh and Orissa have made leprosy. So, having leprosy debars you. And that is unconstitutional because the constitution itself is states that unless you're unsound of mind, uh, bearing a disease does not in fact disqualify you. So we also have these peculiar patches where certain states have in fact created particular conditions to debar candidates at the lowest level. So there is this strange
But in this
hypocrisy
case,
floating there.
what would be the motivation though?
Strangely enough, these were upheld. So when these were challenged, these have been upheld, and the justification or the reasoning was that this would in fact encourage people to study. In a couple of places, it is, for example, Maharashtra has clause that defecating in open would disqualify you, and there's another
That's fair
stage
enough.
which says that your hearing, and if you're impaired, again these are very troubling unconstitutional clauses, because to debar a candidate on grounds of disabilities is also
Yeah.
violates our laws. So, People with Disabilities Act 2016 lists up to 21 disabilities which are in fact recognized, and those are not finite. The court has ruled that these can in fact be expanded. So then to have a leprosy as a ground to is defies logic and plain constitutional sense. Yeah.
Okay.
So, yeah, but I think the most troubling part about the anti-defection law is that not only does it disqualify, it basically ties a legislator to their political party, which means that political parties which are outside parliament or the state legislative assembly now control what's happening within, because they can issue directions, and then everybody has to follow that. And interestingly enough, the only two states in the world to have such a law are India and Pakistan. So it's a little peculiar that these two states do, in fact, have these grounds to disqualify legislators if they, in fact, vote by their own volition. But I think the more troubling thing is when it comes to freedom of speech. And the Constitution mandates that legislators have a greater freedom of speech, where they can, in fact, say within Parliament, and they are not subjected to restrictions, unlike citizens. So citizens speech is regulated by Article 19, under which there are 8 grounds on which uh, what we how we express ourselves can in fact be restricted. However, legislators do not in fact have that, but paradoxically, as a consequence of this, legislators do not in fact vote according to their conscience and are penalized if they do that. Yeah.
Interesting. When it comes to freedom of speech, right? You would expect someone in that position to be able to say whatever they want. Of course, it does sound very paradoxical. You're right. Having said that, I didn't know that there were any people exempt from any of these 8 clauses that apply to
Mhm.
all the citizens. So I'd recently put up this video of this DigiYatra app at the Delhi airport
Mhm.
that verifies you with your Aadhaar, and then once you've done your scan at the airport, the later security checks are all done by facial recognition, and it's one of the coolest things I've experienced at an airport,
Mhm.
and it
Okay.
was the smoothest sailing thing. But I got a lot of comment from people saying this is all cool, but what about privacy and data and stuff? So,
Absolutely.
you have
Mhm.
anything on that front that we could talk about?
Absolutely. So you were just speaking about the restrictions on citizens, and there is a lot of stuff happening which intersects and is interrelated. So the constitutional restrictions on our freedom of speech run into saying anything which affects the sovereignty of state, the security of the state, friendly relations with other states, if it affects public order, if it defames, if it's about contempt of court, if it is affects morality or decency. And the reasons why these were put in was because when India becomes independent, uh, free speech isn't, of course, free. There have to be certain guidelines. Uh, the constitution itself is drafted through partition, so matter we've had a massive displacement of population, and uh, to make sure that in a very volatile situation, speech does not become disruptive to public order. So those are the constitutional guidelines on restrictions on the freedom of speech. But at the same time, with the introduction of the internet, a lot has changed since then. So one of them, of course, is the fact that we do not, in fact, have a data protection bill. So maybe some of the comments to your Digiyatra were related to that. But in 2021, so the major statute which regulates what we information transmitted over the internet is the IT Act 2000, and it does not sufficiently protect personal data. There is a bill at the moment pending in Parliament, the Digital Personal Data Protection Act, and it does in fact try to protect personal data, but we'll come to that in a little bit about how it does that. But first, can we just talk a little bit about the IT Act, because I think that's a little.
Yeah, please. Sure.
So the Information Technology Act is an act which regulates what we say. But so let's start. So three. I'd like to look at three sections. The first section I'd like to talk about is Section 66A, and it says that anyone who transmits or publishes anything which is offensive or annoying can in fact be arrested and convicted for up to 3 years. And this was an amendment by the Congress government. But the point I'd like to reflect upon is that the distinction between the word transmitted and published. So if I do in fact share a private message, it would in fact be covered by transmitted. However, it is not in fact being published. So these two words tend to obfuscate. So what is publishing in legal terms means something which is known to the community. So there is a certain distinction there if I'm sharing a private conversation with a friend, emailing somebody, or versus putting it out on Instagram. 66A, however, was struck down by the Supreme Court when it was found that because of its very vague wording, that if anything is offensive or annoying, uh, it can result to a penal consequence of being arrested and convicted. So it was struck down. However, there's also this gap between what the Supreme Court decides and what actually happens. So the Supreme Court may have struck it down, but 66A is still, in fact, being used to harass, convict people. So that's the first section, which just highlights how we, in fact, need a data protection, a personal data protection act, which focuses on consent and privacy rather than what is being transmitted.
Yeah.
The second two sections also relate to this. So section, I just want to, 1 minute. Could you give me a minute? Yeah, so again, when it comes to privacy and consent, Section 67 again looks at publishing and transmitting anything which is lascivious or prurient. And this echoes the language of the Indian Penal Code, specifically Section 292, which is the obscenity clause, that if you publish anything obscene, then you are in fact liable in court. But again, the point over here is that transmitting something which is lascivious or prurient is not because it is violating the person's privacy or consent, but it is in fact what's happening out there. And 67A, so 67 and 67A are in fact still on the statutes. Make you criminally liable if you share something which is sexually explicit. But so there have been a couple of cases where somebody's put up a video of his girlfriend, which was taken. Now, again, the question of consent is not important here. The point is that he just transmitted it, and that makes him
Yeah.
criminally liable. So these are the important sections which I think we should know about, because one can run into trouble, and one should be aware of these other clauses. And because these are so wide, I'm sure many of us might have in fact already committed, if you share a picture of yourself. So just transmitting a picture become makes one criminally liable. Yeah.
Two things you said about this, right? One is the term annoying. Like, I'm sure
Yeah.
that's like super vague and super subjective, right? Like, I see 10,000 annoying things every day on the internet,
Mhm.
annoying to me. And
Absolutely, yeah.
when you say explicit, right? That was the term you used.
Right, yeah.
Nudity and sexuality, I think, is very straightforward to understand. But what all does explicit encompass?
uh I wish I was an authority to
But this
describe
is
that.
vague, but it's a full.
It is, but there was a recent judgment where the court said it had to be actually explicit, which again really didn't describe. But I would assume they mean the sexual act. Um, but like I mentioned, the concern over here is not about the violation of somebody's privacy, but the concern is more about the impact on public order and these images being shared. And the whole idea of something being lascivious was that if you see something pornographic or if you see something sexually exciting, one is going to not be in a temperate state of mind. And this was a very colonial idea that sexuality should in fact be curbed, and you should not be titillated or find anything scintillating, because just the merely looking at something is enough to, s- s- m- m- uh, make one akin to a crazed person. Again, these are fairly outdated ideas and fairly Victorian ideas, which continue to shape our free speech. Yeah.
So just to understand, if someone took a picture of themselves, which is slightly questionable, and sent it to, let's say, their partner, uh, that is breaking the law.
I'm going by this, yes, because you are transmitting it, and I think the point that it is being transmitted itself makes one, question: is transmission enough for it to be affecting public order, or for it to be? But I think the concern I really don't know why this was put in. I'm not competent enough to say that, but yes, it would, in fact, yeah. So, yeah, so one sees that this boyfriend who was convicted for uploading his girlfriend's pictures was convicted under this particular section, but the girl's privacy and consent was not even considered, which takes us to the fact, where is privacy within our constitution, and why wasn't privacy made a fundamental right? And interestingly, when the constitution was being drafted, a communist member of the Constituent Assembly, Somnath Lahiri, brought this up, and he raised the question: Does the state have the right to, in fact, intrude my home, come in, search my papers, and we need to have a clause about this? But eventually, the decision was made not to, in fact, have an explicit right to privacy. Fascinatingly enough, in the evolution of American jurisprudence and constitutional law, it was the Kodak camera which
Okay.
alarmed many people. So the Kodak camera is invented in the late 19th century, and the fact that everybody had this camera and was busy taking pictures really alarms these two lawyers, Samuel D. Warren and Louis Brandeis. And it is in 1890 that they write an essay called A Right to Privacy, and they define privacy as the right to be left alone, because they're alarmed about technology. So there is a clear interface between technology, surveillance, the Aadhaar card, biometrics, and how it can violate our privacy. And when we think about privacy, it is not just the sense of being left alone, but it is also a spatial thing. It's a physical space, and it's a relationship, so a private relationship. And the underlying understanding is that if there is a violation, that violation is permissible only if there is consent, which of course has completely been blurred by the Aadhaar project. So I don't know, when did you get your Aadhaar card?
I think I was one of the people who held out the most till I
Okay.
got my Aadhaar, and I think eventually it came down to. So what I did not like about the whole Aadhaar thing was not the Aadhaar card, but I think a lot of banks or other people were pressurizing you to link Aadhaar, which was not
Absolutely. Yeah,
required.
yeah.
And my thing is that why
Mm-hmm.
you forcing me to link Aadhaar when it was actually not a mandate that time. Or there was something that HDFC was pesking me about. I was like, it's not required. They're like, no, your account might be deactivated or something like that. I think I
Mm-hmm.
finally got my Aadhaar because you needed it for a rent registration or something like that. It was just easier to do it via the Aadhaar. Otherwise, there were like too many hoops to go through, and I don't think anyone was ready to go through it. I think to me, as someone who's a little more optimistic about a lot of these things, uh, and you were talking about surveillance, right? Like, it's always that right to privacy and surveillance and all are such uh, interlinked things that
Mm-hmm.
there'll always be some compromises, right? At some point, I don't think you can ever have a very black or white conversation or a debate on this. But to me, we'll get into Aadhaar more. But to me, if it's a system that works in terms of uh, making things a lot more future proof in terms of verification and stuff, it's fine.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But if someone has access to my Aadhaar, that is scary. And people give their Aadhaars left, right, and center
Yeah,
as
yeah, they do. Yeah.
ID proofs, right?
Yeah. Interestingly enough, I have a friend who needed to get a chabi made, a key made. So she went to this local the chabi wala just around the corner, and he asked her for her Aadhaar card, which I found crazy enough. And what was crazier was that she just gave it without batting an eyelid, and she just said, "Here, take it," because it has become so much part of the normal everyday routine to be banding around your Aadhaar card. And what is creepy, downright creepy, is how insidious and how pervasive the Aadhaar card has in fact grown. And you think about it, it started as a project, a voluntary project to weed out ghost beneficiaries of state subsidies and social welfare schemes. So from 2010, it starts as a voluntary program. The overarching objective of the state is that there are many bogus beneficiaries who are in fact leaking the state, and this sort of a database will in fact weed that out to the point where it is in fact pretty what's the right word, there's that word which omnipresent, right? Like it's pretty much like everybody has it. Children need it for school admission, so you have 5-year olds with Aadhaar cards. So yes, it's a little frightening how pervasive this biometric database has taken over our world. Yeah.
Yeah, but also I think Aadhaar has this. I don't think like Aadhaar has this one version where you can download it with the numbers masked. But even when people share their Aadhaar card, I never see anyone use that masked version, and it just amazes me how willingly people are ready to share their Aadhaar. Like that, that never ceases to amaze me.
I think it points to the fact how privacy is has different connotations. So maybe people assume that privacy is to do with the physical body or with your home, but the idea that a social identification number is your private identity and not to be bandied around, uh, there seems to be some sort of resistance to that. Also, ki chupane ki kya baat hai? That's the other logic often put forward, that what are we scared of? Hame to chupani, we have nothing to hide. So, I'm not the one who has something to hide. You must be the one who has something to hide. So almost making the person who is making a case for privacy to be the one to be suspect that I'm sure you've done some heinous, grievous crime, and um, that's why you're concealing your identity. But even when the Aadhaar project was underway, there were in fact several objections to that, and some of them came from valid grounds. So, for example, if the objective was to weed out fake beneficiaries, the states of Tamil Nadu and Chhattisgarh had a similar problem, and they fixed their leaks with a mere computerization where they brought down their leaks to 4%. So, they said you don't actually need to have this grand project. You can just computerize your data if that is what your objective is. But with Nandan Nilekani at the helm of affairs, it just, turned into a far greater project. And as a consequence, it's the world's largest social identification project with biometrics. Yeah. And something which
So
the state upheld. Yeah. So 2012 is when the first petition is filed in the Supreme Court, but it is finally heard 6 years later. So when we think about democracy, we also see that it is not just about the conduct of elections, but also about how other institutions are functioning in that system. And we see that the by the time the Supreme Court actually hears this, it's already become this invasive part of everyday life, and then it just fait accompli that up to ho chuka hai. So, and then it upholds it the upholds it as being valid. Yeah.
yeah, like a default standard, right? I think also to what you said, right? Ki, what is there to hide? I think you don't realize any of this till there is a till someone takes your identity or tries to hack into something and they can use your data to do stuff like that. Till any of this happens, it all seems perfectly fine.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But coming back to Digiyatra, like a lot of people on that reel of mine commented saying, yeah, but now they know where you're going and what flight you're taking. But again, coming back to that surveillance thing, I'm as a whichever airport I'm taking a flight from, I'm perfectly fine. Government, police, anyone knowing. Like to me, that is not a violation of my privacy. At least I don't look at it from that standpoint. If it's a public transport use, that's fine.
But I think the point also is what happens to our data. What do data fiduciaries do with it? And I think that's where the personal data protection bill comes into place, which is presently pending. And what this bill does is, for the first time, it recognizes what is personal data, and personal data is defined as any data which you can identify an individual with. That's fair. But I think the more alarming thing is that it exempts the state from it exempts the state from the other restrictions placed on private companies. So the state can, in fact, collect your data, harvest your data, store your data. And over the years, what is the state has, in fact, expanded. So any organization which behaves like the state is, in fact, considered to be the state, which would mean a vast number of organizations and agencies could, in fact, then collect that data, store that data, with there being very little hold what the individual has about what is being done with the data. So, in the Puttaswamy judgment, which is also called the privacy judgment, where Aadhaar was upheld, there was a particular recognition about the right to be forgotten. So, you just mentioned about that you have no problem in, this there being a trail, there being a digital trail about your purchases, about where you've shopped, where
No, no,
the
purchase and all, absolutely not. Public
yeah.
transportation, yes.
Okay, so
Very
even
different.
that, there was this petition made by Bezwada Wilson about the right to be forgotten, about us, about individuals having the right to shape and reshape our identities. But if data is stored indefinitely, there that erasure doesn't occur. So I think the other troubling dimensions about this is that uh, data collected without our consent, data stored indefinitely, data harvested indefinitely with no control about over data fiduciaries, the state being the largest, are alarming dimensions about that.
I also think when it comes to data collection, right, the amount of data someone's collecting cannot be this long form, long defining terms and conditions that no one's going to read.
Mm-hmm.
It has to be upfront when you're uh, installing an app or doing something. And this is something Apple did really well when they of course wiped out a lot of revenue of Facebook by doing this. But
Oh, okay.
uh, so basically, when Apple introduced the whole thing that when you install an app, if the app is tracking you across, it just
Mm-hmm.
says it give you have to disclose right when you install the app whether you want the app to track you or not. And of course, most
Mm-hmm.
people will say no, and they just brought down targeted advertising so much. And Facebook and other people, like even brands like us who used to use performance marketing, the metrics, your returns went down so much. But as a user, I would rather do that because I don't want my, like how you browse something and then
Mm-hmm.
that
Absolutely,
ad
yeah,
follows
yeah.
you everywhere. So Apple did this step which was really, really good, that whatever, if you're asking, if you're tracking someone's behavior on your app, you have to
Mm-hmm.
disclose that right when you install, very clearly, not in some terms and conditions.
Yeah, and that takes us to the IT rules. So, although we don't have a data protection bill yet, so growing by the IT Act, these IT rules were introduced in 2021. And these, in fact, obligate social media intermediaries, where they are now obliged to inform users about the data, about the restrictions, about what sort of material they can post, what they cannot post, and going back to the restrictions on our free speech, what these IT rules have also done is that they've introduced new grounds on which your post can, in fact, be taken down. So, if one concern is privacy and consent, the other concern is about new restrictions being placed upon what we can post and what we cannot post. So, just to refer a few things. So, for example, uh, content which is harmful to a child, content which is insulting on the basis of gender, consent which is knowingly or unintentionally putting out information which is false or misleading. And what these IT rules obligate social media intermediaries is to pull this content down within 36 hours, 72 hours. And if they do not do that, then they would, in fact, have to face a block. I mean, they would have to be blocked by a government order. But what one sees is that the online space is being regulated by grounds which are not in the constitution, nor are they elsewhere. And there are these, again, to use the word vague, these are fairly vague grounds on which what you say can in fact be pulled down with no grounds, with no space, with no trial, with no hearing as to why, what, and allows social media intermediaries, this great power, this control over what we are saying and what we are posting. And since you mentioned Apple, what is the definition of a social media intermediary? So I'm just going to read that
Yeah,
out. So it's defined as one which primarily or solely enables interaction between one or more users, right? So it's not even on the basis of the number of users, that if you have 100 plus users or Twitter, but basically any a private e-commerce platform would also qualify and then be obliged to take down content which violates these fairly new grounds on which restriction can be clamped. So yeah. um
interesting. I think we should take a small little break. I also want
okay.
to you now I want to talk about Twitter as well, because again, what's happened with Twitter over the last few months with Elon Musk and all is so fascinating, and a lot of these questions again come up. So yeah, we'll take a short little break and we'll
Okay.
come back to Anish thing.
Hey everyone, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. We have a special announcement introducing Club Paisa Vaisa, where you get episodes of Paisa Vaisa 3 days before release, bonus and ad-free content, and access to the full show archive. So get your yearly membership today for only Rs. 699. Log on to club.ivmpodcast.com/Paisa Vaisa. On Cyrus Says, Cyrus welcomes novelist Shobha Day on the show. They talk about her book Insatiable, My Hunger for Life, that has a unique take on life and how one should celebrate it. On Think Fast, Varun and Suchita talk about Google Bard versus MS ChatGPT, Disney layoffs, and LinkedIn clocking 100 million members in India. On Explain Like I'm 10, Meghna talks to Kartika VK, publisher at Westland, and Urjita Wani, comedian, on how to publish a book. New episodes are out on the All About Now feed. And on Pulyabazi, Khyati, Saurabh and Pranay talk to author Anirudh Suri about his book, The Great Tech Game. Once again, do not forget to visit our merch store on ivmpodcast.com. We've got some super cool and exciting stuff over there for you and your loved ones. Follow us on social media. We are at IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. If you like our shows, then do not forget to spread the word. It really helps us a lot. And of course, don't forget to rate our shows on whatever platform you are listening to them. And of course, all our video shows are also available on youtube.com/IVM Podcasts. And finally, we would like to thank our sponsors this week, Yono SBI, Capgemini, and HDFC Mutual Fund. Thank you so much for making this possible.
Welcome back to Anish thing. I'm talking to Priya, and yeah, lots of fascinating stuff that I should have known of, but like you just don't end up thinking about a lot of these things on a daily basis. But
Mhm.
speaking about social media platforms, I think what's also really fascinating is the whole Elon Musk Twitter takeover, where a lot of
Right.
the debate is that like Twitter was not there was no engineering problems with Twitter. It was more about political problems, right? That for example, Trump got banned,
Yeah.
but that was purely because of him violating the community guidelines that Twitter put in. And then Elon Musk saying that, you know what, there has to be absolute freedom of speech. This is a town hall. Everyone should be able to say everything. And then he went and banned one of the accounts that just relays information. It's fully automated because, again, the data of his private jet is public data. And he went and banned Elon Jet, the Twitter account. So to me, the interesting thing about Twitter is that now one person has that power. Earlier, at
Mm-hmm.
least there were more people involved, or there would be whatever. But currently, someone like an Elon Musk can completely dictate what he can do, can't do, remove, who to add on a platform like Twitter. That's huge. So I think this whole what defines an app or rules and stuff is it's such an ongoing debate.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think these spaces are, there is, I mean, we're at that intersection where are these public spaces? So, if, for example, even the analogy of a town hall is interesting because not everybody can, in fact, access a town hall, and there are questions of caste and gender which emerge over there. But even if we leave that aside, these are, how do we see them? Are they public platforms? Are they private platforms? And even if Once sets aside Elon Musk, we have AIs regulating speech. So, for instance, there was this case of this hugely popular chess commentator whose YouTube channel was banned because the AI detected him repeatedly saying, "Black has defeated white." White received a crushing blow from black, and the AI couldn't place the context that this is in fact a game of chess, and his channel was blocked for a couple of days. So I think the question is not just of public or private platform, it is also about how it is artificial intelligence which is now mediating what is speech, how free it is, and what in fact can be said or not. There have been a couple of other cases where Twitter has arbitrarily pulled down content because it has violated some of these guidelines, which again are very, very broad. Like, who's to say what is false or misleading information without due process in place? How does one decide that? So yes, we are at an interesting juncture between technology, surveillance, free speech, private ownership of allegedly public platforms. Yeah.
Yeah, ownership is another such a topic, right? Like, what do you own and not own? Like, if you buy a car, you own the hardware, but then if the car company charges you a software monthly to run the software on it, who's ultimately owning it? Uh, it's super fascinating.
Yeah, and then we get back into the whole liberal socialist debate about ownership and entitlement and what you can lay claim on and what you can't. Yeah.
So I'd put up a reel. So whenever I go to Gurgaon, of course Gurgaon is super cheap alcohol prices. So I'll usually put out a reel saying, okay, this is the update. This is what's happening in Gurgaon. These brands are available. And I'd recently put up some one of these reels of alcohol prices, and that reel got removed. And Instagram said
Okay.
this has violated community guidelines, and we've removed your thing. So I did an appeal because I was like, "There's everything is factually correct. Like there's nothing that I'm putting out. I'm literally putting out a shopping list." And that appeal got rejected. And then there is a higher thing you have to apply for, which I have still not heard back from them.
Mm,
But this was some automated thing that triggered something, and that was taken down.
I'm on fuzzy grounds here, but is this because it is illegal to advertise alcohol? Is that the reason?
I don't know, but it's not even advertising. I'm literally putting out a price list, and it's not one brand as such. So I don't know.
But I'm intrigued. I'm intrigued.
Like I really want to get the explanation of why it was removed, because uh, I don't have that explanation from them, which is what will be interesting to see what the reasoning was.
Yeah, and I think the broader effect that this has on people is the chilling effect that you would rather not say something of the fear that there are going to be consequences to that. So silence then replaces your fundamental right to in fact saying stuff. So
Also,
yes, that's the
anything on the internet will just remain, right? Like what you said, the right to forget or whatever. Like there has
yeah,
to be
yeah.
some button or option to do that. Like take this away.
Yeah, true, true. Like pictures of yourself 10 years ago, which may mildly embarrass you today,
Yeah, they do.
would be some of them, yes. Yeah.
Priya, before we end the episode, anything else you want to talk about or recap or touch upon?
Yeah, I think electoral bonds is something which I think deeply damage our democratic processes, and because it allows it allows political parties to be absolutely beyond the purview of the right of voters to know. Interestingly, political parties are not covered by the Right to Information Act. So, although the irony is that although political parties can in fact be funded anonymously by corporate donors, there's been a recent amendment to the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act, which regulates funding for non-government organizations, NGOs, and these are fairly prohibitive and in stark contrast to what political parties are allowed to get away with. So, NGOs are now obliged to open their bank account at Sansad Marg at the SBI branch at Sansad Marg. They need an Aadhaar card for clearance of all
Of
funds. So
course.
that's another instance. And it also prevents the transfer of foreign contributions to other organizations. So previously, NGOs being funded by foreign companies or contributors could then, pass that money on, but there's a restriction on that, and that has severely affected the fundamental right to association. And that's what the petitioner in this particular case argued, but it was the FCRA amendment has in fact been upheld. So we see these terrible paradoxes, these terrible ironies of India's democracy at 75, which create this peculiar hierarchy where political parties are hugely wealthy. Voters seem to have no way to knowing who's funding their political parties. Uh, Parliamentarians are getting wealthier, and yet there is no way of really knowing how much money, where's it coming from, and this is certainly alarming.
Fair point. So I'm not here equating the funding of political parties to NGO, but then a cynic in me says that okay, if you're an NGO, why not have these restrictions? What's the problem to disclose everything? Because again, the image somewhere is that there could be so much money laundering happening there, uh, and we've heard stories like that. So again, not
Ah,
equating it to the political party funding, but like to me, this part doesn't sound that alarming. Like
oh, it doesn't. Okay.
what am I missing there? Like
I think financial transparency can be achieved by not making it harder for NGOs to function. To me, the objective seems to make it harder for NGOs to subsist on foreign contributions, where again the foreign contribution itself is suspect, whereas it seems to be perfectly fair to allow it to fund something which underpins the democratic
democracy.
process itself. So it doesn't seem to add up. Yeah. So yeah.
Fair. No, that's fair. Priya, thank you so much for being on Anish Thing. How can people find you on social media? And I'm assuming your podcast is on all platforms.
It is. So on Twitter, I'm at fundamentally P, and on Instagram, I'm the longest constitution. So that's where they can find me. I'm on a break at the moment, but I will be back presumably very soon. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Thank you.